the legacy of the American Revolution. Briefly, if you want to study about the Native Americans who fought in the uh, American Revolution, that is also an interesting subject to study. Um, Also, there were the women who fought in the American Revolution, as well as the African Americans who fought in the American Revolution in exchange for their um, emancipation. And of course, a lot of those other Americans who weren't classified as Americans at the time, but of course still fought for the American cause. We also had the Sons of Liberty, and we also had the Daughters of Liberty as well. But also, the legacy of the Revolution wasn't just that of constitutionalism, it was also a belief in equality. American constitutionalism is not the only important legacy of the Revolution. The Declaration of Independence, with its statement that all men are created equal, probably has had a greater impact on America and the world at large than America's constitutional system. Ho Chi Minh invoked those very words in the 1945 Declaration of Independence that he wrote for the Republic of Vietnam. For Americans themselves, the idea of equality was certainly the most radical and most powerful force let loose in the Revolution, and it was much more radical and powerful than Thomas Jefferson or any of the founders and any of the ideas that they had realized. Of course, once invoked, the idea of equality could not be stopped, and it tore through American society and culture with awesome force. It became what Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick, called the great God absolute, the spirit of equality. Melville said, spread a mantle of humanity over all Americans and brought democratic dignity to even the arm that wields a pick or drives a spike. Southerners and would-be aristocrats in the North vainly tried to argue that Jefferson could never have meant that all men were literally equal and that they all had equal rights. But that was precisely what most Americans, at least in the North, came to believe, and some came to say not just white men, but also black men and had equal rights as well. And some eventually went insofar as to say that not just men, but women had these rights as well. Of course, the anti-slavery movement and the Women's Convention at Seneca Falls in the year 1848 were the consequence of this American commitment to equality. Within decades following the Declaration of Independence, the United States became the most egalitarian nation in the history of the entire world. Indeed, the desire for equality continues to drive most of America's current public debates, whether over affirmative action, gay rights, or the role of women. Jefferson and the other revolutionary leaders made much of equality, but they did not mean by equality a leveling of their society. They thought of equality primarily as equality of opportunity. They wanted positions of leadership determined by talent and merit, not by lineage or social position. They wanted what Jefferson called a natural, not just a artificial aristocracy, and they concocted three-tiered systems of public education in order to recruit talented leaders from society. They thought that making merit the criterion of leadership would lead to a circulation of elites, and no traditional aristocracy would have time to harden and perpetuate itself. In the end, the concept of equality meant more to the founders than equality of opportunity. Indeed, if equality had meant only equality of opportunity, or even a rough equality of property holding, it could never have become, as it has, the single most powerful and radical ideological force in American history. Equality became so potent for Americans because it came to mean that everyone was really as the same as everyone else, not just at birth, not in talent or property or wealth, and not just in some transcendental religious sense of the equality of all souls. But Jefferson and many of the other founders came to conclude that all humans were basically alike, that they all partook of the same common nature. They believed that there was something in each human being, some sort of moral sense or sympathetic instinct, which made possible natural compassion and affection. Even the lowliest of persons, they assumed, had this sense of sympathy for others and the capacity to tell right from wrong. Quote, "State a moral case to a plowman and a professor," said Jefferson. "The former will decide it as well, and often better, than the latter, because he has not been led astray by artificial rules." End quote. This belief in the equal moral worth of every individual was the real source of America's democratic equality, an equality that was far more potent than merely the idea that everyone started at birth with the same blank slate, to coin the term by John Locke. Ordinary Americans came to believe that no one in a basic down-to-earth and day-in and day-out manner was really better than anyone else. They came to have a sense of self-worth and dignity that allowed them, regardless of their lack of wealth or education, to look others in the eye and treat them as equals, and to expect to be treated as equals in return. The revolutionaries' idea of equality was very permissive, and those who invoked it had little inkling of the lengths to which it could or would be carried out. Equality immediately rendered suspect all kinds of distinctions, whether naturally derived or not. In a free and independent republic, it was said in the 1780s, quote, "The idea of equality breathes through the whole, and every individual feels ambitious to be in a situation not inferior to his neighbor." End quote. Among Americans, the idea of inferiority, as of pursuing a mean employment or occupation, mortifies the feelings and sours the minds of those who feel themselves inferior. Consequently, everyone strives to be equal with those above him in dress, if nothing else. But a society that had no place for inferiorities of occupation and dress was an unusual society indeed. Of course, this was drawing out the idea of equality faster and further than any of the founders had even expected. Of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was quoted that the history of the past is but one long struggle upward to equality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton remained married for 47 years. Nonetheless, she felt that the custom of calling women Mrs. John and this and Mrs. Tom, that, and colored men Sambo and Zipcoon, is founded on the principle that white men are lords of all. Of course, she saw the sexism in the society of her day. And of course, under these circumstances, aristocracy, natural as well as artificial, quickly became a pejorative term, at least in the North, and many of those who wished for a political career had to appear as plain and as straightforward as the people who voted for them. Politicians played down their college educations and claimed that they were just ordinary folk born in log cabins. White servants refused to call their employers master. For many, the term boss derived from the Dutch word for master. It became a euphemistic substitute. The servants themselves would not be called anything but help. By the early 19th century, there were greater disparities of wealth in American society than had existed in the colonial period. Yet the society felt more equal and lauded itself for its egalitarianism, a paradox that has puzzled more than one historian, of course. With the disappearance or diminution in American society of nearly all the traditional aristocratic distinctions, as Alexis de Tocqueville noted in the 1830s, there was, quote, "hardly anything left but money to separate one person from another." For many Americans in the new democratic society, the ability to make money had become the sole and only proper means for distinguishing one person from another. Catherine Sedgwick spoke for all the old aristocracy when she observed of the emerging 19th century entrepreneurial hierarchy. She said, "Wealth, you know, is the grand leveling principle," end quote. And of course, here we say that white servants refused to call their employers master. And for many, the term boss was derived from the Dutch word for master. All these consequences alone make the American Revolution one of the great revolutions of world history, but perhaps the most important legacy of the Revolution is the way in which it had affected America's conception of its role in the world, a conception that still seems to have resonance today. The Revolutionary War began on the 19th of April in 1775 with, as Emerson put it in the mid-19th century, again, that's Ralph Waldo Emerson, a, quote, "shot heard around the world," end quote. That, in fact, was how the revolutionaries and sympathetic foreigners saw the revolution, as an event of worldwide significance. And indeed, no one still knows to this day whether it was the, they were both Englanders, but no one knows that it was those who were with the crown of George III or those who were with the rebels. No one knows who shot the first shot at at Lexington, or Concord actually. So for the people of America, numbering only 2.5 million, huddled along a narrow strip of the Atlantic coast, 3,000 miles from the centers of civilization, to claim that their little colonial rebellion possessed universal importance was the height of audacity. Of course, yet the revolutionaries and their heirs in the 19th century sincerely believed that they were bringing Libertas and republicanism not only to America but also to the rest of the entire globe. America's conception of itself as the leader of the free world began in the year 1776. I recommend the book 1776 by David McCullough. Americans launched their revolution with very high hopes that other peoples would follow their lead, throw off monarchies, and become republics. Naturally, at first they saw the French Revolution of 1789 as a copy of their own revolution, and they welcomed the effort as well as that of the revolution in Haiti. But its rapid perversion and excesses, that being the ending in Napoleonic despotism, disillusioned many Americans about the ability of other peoples to emulate them in becoming Republican, and tempered their optimism about the future. Of course, they tried to... America was at a different place in time in history than was the French, so trying to emulate the Americans had to take into account their own present time and their context. Of course, these doubts soon played into American attitudes toward the Latin American colonial rebellions that broke out in the early decades of the 19th century. If any revolutions were emulations of the American Revolution, these rebellions against Spanish imperialism certainly seemed to be. And of course, Americans such as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson welcomed them, but at the same time, they were skeptical of the South Americans' ability to create free republican governments. I feared from the beginning, Jefferson wrote in the year 1821, that these people were not as yet sufficiently enlightened for self-government, and that after wading through blood and slaughter, they would end in military tyrannies, more or less numerous, end quote. Thus, Americans from the outset had an ambiguous attitude toward republican revolutions in other parts of the world. Naturally, there was no hostility, only sympathy and enthusiasm, mixed with a kind of patronizing pessimism, bred on an anxiety that other peoples would not have the social and moral qualities necessary in order to carry through successful republican revolutions. Nevertheless, Americans continued to believe that they, and not the French, were the center of the international revolution. And despite promising not to intervene in Europe's internal affairs and expressing a desire to have no entangling alliances with Europe, most 19th century Americans remained very concerned with what went on there. Yet they were reluctant to get directly involved in any revolutionary ventures that might endanger their own republican experiment. And of course, believing that people who were ready for republicanism would sooner or later become Republicans as they had, Americans concluded that they could best accomplish their mission of bringing free governments to the rest of the world simply by existing as a free government, by being an exemplar to the world. So Americans watched and encouraged all the 19th century revolutions. They did not intervene, indeed, but they did in every other way. Individuals raised money for the rebels, and some went off to fight on behalf of revolutionary movements. In all the European revolutions of the century, the Greek Revolt of 1821, the French constitutional transformation of 1830, the general European insurrections of 1848, and the overthrow of the Second French Empire and the establishment of the Third French Republic in the year 1870. The United States was usually the first nation to extend diplomatic recognition to new revolutionary regimes. After all, in the Americans' eyes, these European revolutions were simply efforts by oppressed peoples to become like them, all species of the same revolutionary genius, Americanus. At first, Americans were unthreatened by these revolutions and had no fear whatsoever of the spread of revolutionary ideas, except the successful African slave rebellion that occurred in Haiti in the year 1804. As we've mentioned earlier, the United States did not recognize the Haitian Republic, the first free black republic of its kind, until the Civil War. But Americans welcomed all the others and toasted revolutionary patriots, like the Hungarian Louis Kossuth in 1852 when they came to America in search of money and support. Of course, naturally, this encouragement of revolution did not endear us to the European monarchies, but 19th century Americans were proud of their example and simply assumed that they were the cause of all the revolutionary upheavals in Europe. Ulysses S. Grant said in 1885, quote, "The right of revolution is an inherent one. When people are oppressed by their government, it is a natural right they enjoy to relieve themselves of oppression, if they are strong enough, whether by withdrawal from it or by overthrowing it and substituting a government more acceptable," end quote. When the Habsburg monarchy protested American sympathy for the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, Secretary of State Daniel Webster accepted nothing less than full American responsibility for the European uprisings. In the year 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant even had the audacity to congratulate the French for using American political ideas in overthrowing the Second Empire and establishing the Third Republic. With the Russian Revolution of 1917, however, everything changed. Again, we're talking about the Bolshevik Revolution. At first, with the March 1917 overthrow of the Tsar and the formation of the Provisional Government, Americans welcomed the Russian Revolution as they had welcomed earlier anti-monarchical governments or European revolutions. 7 days after the Tsar abdicated, the United States extended diplomatic recognition to the new Russian government, the first power in the world to do so. President Woodrow Wilson now thought that he had a fit partner for a League of Honor, a league that he hoped would be a means for the worldwide extension of democracy. In May of 1917, the American ambassador in Moscow wrote that he expected Russia to come out of its ordeal as a republic and with a government founded on correct principles, that is to say, principles similar to those of the American Republic. When the Bolsheviks took over the revolution in the fall of 1917, however, all this initial enthusiasm quickly disappeared. Instead of its firmest friend, the United States suddenly became the bitterest enemy of the Russian Revolution. Instead of quickly extending diplomatic recognition to the new regime, the United States withheld diplomatic recognition from the Soviet Union for 16 years and 4 American presidencies, making the United States the last major Western power to recognize the revolutionary regime. In light of America's earlier revolutionary tradition, this was a remarkable turnabout. A turnabout, however, that is explicable only in terms of that earlier revolutionary tradition. The cause of the abrupt change of attitude can be found in the nature of the Bolshevik appeal, the new character of the communist ideology. The Bolsheviks claimed not simply to be leading another anti-monarchical Republican revolution in emulation of the American or the French models. The Russian Revolution was a new revolutionary genius altogether, a totally new departure in world history. And of course, when Warren Harding delivered his State of the Union address to Congress in 1921, the government's position on the Russian Revolution had solidified. He said that we do not recognize the government of Russia, nor tolerate the propaganda which emanates therefrom. The antagonism that sprang up between the United States and the Soviet Union rested not simply on power politics or on contrasting marketing systems, but more importantly on the competitiveness of two very different revolutionary traditions. The Cold War really began in 1917 in the early 20th century. The Soviet Union threatened nothing less than the displacement of the United States from the vanguard of history. For the first time since 1776, Americans were faced with an alternative revolutionary ideology with universalist aspirations equal to their own. Of course, the Russians, not the Americans, now claimed to be pointing the way toward the future. And with this dramatic emergence of an opposing revolutionary ideology, Americans in the 20th century grew more and more confused about themselves and their place in history. They could not very well stand against the idea of revolution, but at the same time, they could no longer be very enthusiastic about revolutions that they assumed would be communist. America's Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union and the USSR eventually culminated in its disastrous intervention in Vietnam in the 1960s. During the time, 1960 was the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. Of course, most Americans thought that they were simply following President John F. Kennedy's call in 1961 to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, or oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. But suddenly, in 1989, everything changed again. The Soviet Union collapsed, and with it collapsed its revolutionary aspirations to make the world over as communist. But even before 1991, before the United States could fully enjoy its victory over this rival, Soviet revolutionary ideology, it found itself on the 11th of September in the year 2001 in a new and a very different war, a war against terror. Whether America's revolutionary traditions and its long existing desire to make the world safe for democracy will enable it to wage this war successfully remains to be seen. Of course, as we know, we've already fought many wars there, one of which was 20 years long and ended in absolutely nothing. But the United States still sees itself, as it did in 1776, as the leader of the free world and assumes that the democratic principles for which it stands resonate universally around the globe. That's the bird up there. It's the daddy bird feeding its mama birds. The father bird's up there feeding the small birds. And you might have heard earlier the hawks over there making a lot of noise. E Publius Unum. In the national pantheon of heroes, the founders have achieved mythic proportions. Legislators and jurists routinely refer to the founders' intent. The motto E Publius Unum, from many, one, appears to ratify the idea of monolithic harmony. Using national parks, for example, that focus on the lives of founders, you can see that linguist equation, E Publius Unum, for themselves. It is easy to find similarities, consensus, and interlocking relationships. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin hailed from Greater Boston. Thomas Stone, Charles Pinckney, and George Washington lived on plantations dependent on enslaved Africans, as well as that of Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson served in Washington's cabinet. William Floyd, Stone, Adams, and Franklin signed the Declaration of Independence. Washington and Pinckney served as officers in the Army during the Revolution. Washington, Pinckney, and Hamilton attended the Constitutional Convention and played important roles in drafting the Constitution. But what about the Publius side? Well, by the Revolution, the colonies already were ethnically, religiously, economically, and radically diverse. At the Battle of Kings Mountain, for example, that occurred right here in my hometown, virtually all the combatants on both sides were Americans. French settlers helped George Rogers Clark capture Fort Sackville. The Ethiopian regiment of ex-slaves fought with the British in Virginia. While elected leaders included no women or African Americans, even this reduced sample of founders contains intriguing differences. Hamilton was an immigrant from the West Indies. He and Thomas Jefferson squabbled continuously, of course. Franklin and Adams held radically different outlooks on personal lifestyle. Patrick Henry's speeches electrified patriots, but he smelt a rat when delegates such as Washington, Hamilton, and Pinckney, among others, met at the Constitutional Convention. Henry and a diverse group of other anti-federalists vigorously opposed the Constitution. Optimistic motto aside, many wondered whether national unity or irreconcilable diversity would carry the day. And so that is our end of the American Revolution series. Happy Independence Day.